The morning session is Eva Cox. Eva was born, Eva Horser, in Vienna in 1938, and I apologise, Eva, if I'm not pronouncing your surname the right way. Hauser, I beg your pardon, and was soon declared stateless by Hitler. So she grew up as a refugee in England till 1946, Italy, and then Australia from 1948. She remembers being cross in kindergarten that boys were offered drums and girls the tambourine or the triangle. All these early experiences primed her political activism and made her an irrepressible advocate for making societies fairer. She is an unabashed feminist and passionately promotes inclusive, diverse and equitable ways of living together. She was the ABC Boyer Lecturer in 1995 on making societies more civil and is still trying to do so. Her 1996 book, Leading Women, explained why women who made a difference were usually labelled as difficult, a theme we've heard already today, a label she wears as a changed necessity. Her childcare involvement is extensive, starting in 1972 under Whitlam. She was instrumental in setting up CCC New South Wales after a stoush with the Victorian founder. This stoush was based on whether it would be sufficiently community-based. She now wonders where the sector is going. Eva, welcome to the stage to talk about children in a good society.
Can I say thank you to Deborah for actually giving me a very good point to sort of take off from, because I was beginning to feel that I was going to be so much more radical than anything else that was being said. Now I think what I'm going to say is probably fairly ordinary. But I do want to start with the fact that when we set up community childcare, it was actually a fairly radical thing. And I think there's actually a bit of soul searching to go on to see whether you are still really a radical organisation. In those days, we set it up because it was part of the feminist movement. I notice you are using purple as one of the main colours of today, which is one of the feminist colours. And purple is for passion. Green was for growth, and I think white was for purity, but we gave that up fairly simply, fairly early. But I think it's actually important to put back and decide on how it all fitted together in a much more radical way than it's now. And it's not just the childcare area. I think generally we've forgotten about it. I keep telling younger women that actually feminism was not about being equal to men. In fact, we had a slogan which said any woman who wanted to be equal to men had a very low level of ambition. And I think we need to revive it. It was about changing the world and making it a better place to live in, by actually incorporating all of those areas that are the feminised, soft community, society, relationship parts of society, to incorporate those into what was important, so that war, trade, production, money, institutions, etc., industry, was not the only thing that counted as important. Unlike Jane, I don't think we wanted to get half the control. We wanted to get sufficient control to make sure that we actually change things. And that's got lost over the years. And I think it's got lost in childcare. Pache, Lynn, I'm going to disagree very strongly with some of the things you said about education. I know an awful lot of educated people who are dead shit, selfish, self-interested, wouldn't know a decent thing to fall over, and it's not everything. I think there's a serious danger, if we get hit on the term education, that we get stuck with some of the sorts of problems that we actually have at the moment with education. At the moment, education is labelled entirely as get a job. It's one of my major criticisms of our last Prime Minister. She might have been a woman, but she had a very distorted view of what the possibilities were. If you didn't get a job, you didn't exist. We have jobs, many of them are unpaid, and we need to actually recognise that they are actually a contribution. And we need to actually start criticising the fact that longer hours seem to be sort of related more and more to things. We actually had discussions in the 70s about what would happen when technology cut back working hours and we'd have all of those hours of leisure. I don't think much would happen to them. I think they've disappeared with a paperless office. But I think we actually need to get back to actually having a much broader sense of what both community childcare and childcare generally was about. As part of the feminist things, it was not about just freeing women to get jobs. It was not about educating little bastards so they get 15 hours a week and be able to get a job when they're 18, which seems to be the equation that seems to be thrown up at us constantly. It was about changing the way, recognising that there was something unnatural about cooping up one adult with a couple of children in a house on their own most of the day, that this was not the normal way of bringing up children, that if you look back, children were part, in a sense, of a more tribal, more social, more connected communities. And certainly modernity, industrialisation and the sort of nuclear family had become a fairly sort of patriarchal, if you want, being also sort of capitalist version of a consumption unit. And part of community childcare's movement, and part of the arguments we had with Winston McCackey, were about the fact that children's services were actually about expanding the ways that we took care of kids, not just kids of women in the workforce, all children, to make sure that they had contact with other adults, other children, and were socialised into being good human beings. Not that they just became educated and got their literacy standards up. That's the emphasis. That's what we've slipped into. So I think you've got to be very wary when you use the word education. And I would even say, and I'll say this quite solemnly, it's quite insulting to use that term, particularly in the terms that you're using it, particularly if you think about Indigenous stuff. If you think about that, I don't know how many Indigenous people there are in the audience here. The whole idea of learning within that sort of structure is very different to the way that we learn within the structures we've got. And we do not necessarily adapt our early childhood services or our education services to recognise the advantages that you can culturally get from learning from your elders, from yarning, from the celebrations, the ceremonies, the traditions, the relationships that count. They're all part of something. And I think we have to be very wary, and I would pay my respects here to the Gadigal people and the Eora Nation, and thank you for allowing us to use your land, that we don't make assumptions that basically education, which is currently defined very much in white, male, majoritarian terms, even to some degree in the early childhood area, is not something that we value over and above the socialisation, the relationship building, the informal processes, which I know do occur in children's services, but that they often they fall down and get overcome by a sort of much more industrialised version of what's happening. We've seen it happen with the education system where NAPLAN has taken over to a fair degree about what is valued in education. I think we've got to be careful. I know it's important that we've redefined all the workers in the early childhood area as educators, that we stick with a very broad definition of education and a very feminist definition of education, that make sure that we actually push those things which are not going to contribute to our being able to get a job, being able to advance and being able to become right-wing, masculinised little dead shits, which is I think what the government would prefer us to do. You know, chuck out all your rallies if you're an Indigenous person, get yourself a mortgage and turn into a nasty little shit like everybody else, and then you'll actually be assimilated. I think we've got to get away from that sort of vision and get back to something which is much more collectivist, much more about society. And my motto at the moment, if you're interested, I'm not quite sure how we do it, but I'd be interested in talking to Deborah about it, is how do we actually promote the idea that we live in a society and not an economy? We've just been through an entire election which told us we live in an economy. The social was only mentioned in terms of screwing both people, which I have obviously a history background, screwing single parents because they didn't have a job, and actually most of them did, but that's another sort of issue, and various other things which happened on both sides. Labour did not have a good record in terms of that terms like social justice just disappeared. Social justice in labour terms, or social inclusion as they then called it, meant getting you onto the ladder that everybody else was on and not questioning the ladder and not questioning what it was. I think we have to start thinking really about the society we want to live in. We need to think about who we are and what we are and how we actually create relationships. I think we've got to talk about taking collective responsibility for many of the risks that we face and not assume that the market will provide. I think we've got to start looking at issues around the absolute dominance of the material over the associational, the relational, the ethics, all of those things that make society worth living in. I think what Deborah showed us was some very good visual ways of trying to convince people that we were getting things wrong. But I think the childcare sector has lost its way. It sucked in, and I was part of that. Up to the 1980s, we were very clear that childcare or children's services were part of the community sector, deeply embedded in it, run according to the cultures and the relationships there, something which parents were involved in, something which was part of the whole structure of community. By the 80s, neoliberalism had started, and I recently went to hear Michael, I think it was not Michael, I can't think what the second name at the moment is, from Harvard, who was talking about the way that neoliberalism had coarsened our ability to make judgments. When you put money into the picture, it actually distorts the whole moral and ethical sort of frameworks that we judge things on. And I was part of the movement in the 1980s that started selling the idea that childcare was important because it had economic things. We did it because that was the way the arguments were going. That was the way that public money was being allocated. And we became part of that. But some of us didn't believe in it. We did it because it was the way we could get money out of things. Too many people did believe it. And if you take a look at it, by the sort of mid-80s, things were beginning to change. By the early 90s, when they started funding the commercial sector, childcare had moved from being a community service to an industry. It is now an industry, partaker even the not-for-profit sector. Most of the large not-for-profits I know of behave exactly as shittily as the for-profit groups. They are big industrial, commercially run things. They might be slightly more ethical than some of the commercial centres. But basically they run themselves on a for-profit basis. None of them are really prepared to tell the government that this is not the way to run things. None of them are really prepared to sort of point out what the serious issues are around there. I mean, I was part of, as I say, I was the first World Child Care Coordinator in 1972. We pushed childcare onto the federal government agenda with the Whitlam government. When I was, some years later, and we did a lot of work on childcare at that particular stage, I was compensating for the fact I felt extremely guilty about my then young daughter's ability to get a childcare place because I jumped a family, a Sydney Day nursery waiting list because I was a nice middle-class mum who'd spent a little bit of time at Waverley College, and so, I jumped a waiting list of probably much more needy people, and I felt guilty about it, and I've been doing penance for the last 45 years. But what was really clear at that stage was that children's services had to be part of something. We fought against the division between preschools and childcare, and we fought the preschool and the lobby and all sorts of other things around that. But the idea behind community childcare, which we did set up, and I was director of NCOS in 1978, and I went with Ros Day to Melbourne to talk to Winston McCackey, and we had a session on that. Winston said community childcare is about local communities. We said there are other sorts of communities, including workplace communities. We had a real shit fight. She eventually gave in and allowed us to use the name. But the whole idea was that children's services were part of the community. It was very much part of changing the way that we reared children so that we could rear them more collectively, to take the responsibility away from parents to some degree, with a recognition that being part of the community was of great benefit to those children who didn't have crash-hot parents, as well as benefit to children who didn't have other kids to play with, as well as a benefit for the community that you turned out more civilised adults, hopefully. And somewhere along the way, that disappeared as part of the argument. But before it disappeared, one of the other things I was responsible for was I actually set up a lot of the framework of what the policies were, which were run by the Hawke government, which was the idea of actually allocating children's children's services, capital, works and resources on a needs-based model. We set that up when I was director of NCOS. We pushed it when I worked for Don Grimes, who was the shadow minister. Throughout the 80s, we distributed children's services on the basis of planning models. By the time we got to the 90s, we now have children's services where they stop providing capital, they stop approving where places are. We have children's services where there's no plan for distribution, there's no limit on where you put children's services. They stopped actually funding children's services directly, so they've left it to the market. I'm yet to hear a really strong thing pointing out how abominable the particular current funding system is. It makes no sense on any sort of basis. You know, it is one of the few services, because I mean, why would you pay the same level of subsidy, at least in the, in the childcare benefit area, for a 6-month-old child and a 5-year-old? There's no logic to it. There's absolutely no basis to it. It's not a good way to plan. It doesn't allow services flexibility. The original type of funding was direct to the centre. There's no contact between the centre and the funding body, which is totally bizarre when you look at other things like nursing homes. And yet the sector is not clear about that. And we had the Labour government running around saying, oh, well, if we want more children's services, we've got to be nicer to the private sector so that they build more. You know, they even funded something in Sydney to get rid of some of the local government regulations so that they could get more commercial things there. The commercial motive does not work in children's services. I'm not saying that every commercial service is awful. Some of them are quite good. Some of them are small services run by people who are absolutely passionate about what they do. The differences between them and the community sector are probably reasonably small. But the fact that we've got large things like Good Start, as well as the larger commercial things like that, takes away from the local community any sense that these services belong to them, or they've got any input into them. Takes it away from the whole idea that it can be part of a local service. Takes it away from the fact that it has to actually be there. The idea is that because you have market choices and the money is paid to the parents, that the parents will be able to make sure that the fees stay low and the quality stays high and the services are what they want. Guess what? Market forces don't work. We found that in the GFC. How many of you here think that market forces actually work as an allocation for childcare? You're too scared to put your hands up. That's a good thing to try and be a bit too scared not to say it. Because we actually need to get out there and point out that the government is wasting a large amount of money through the fact that it's funding services not on the basis of where the needs are, but on the basis of the fact that they're there. That it's funding services that run at hours which are not suitable for the parents, so suddenly you've got a pressure to have nannies instead. Running services which don't actually meet the needs of the particular age groups that want them, because it's too expensive to run services for children who are under the age of 2 rather than over the age of 2. And yes, I'm delighted that we've got some standards and various other things, but everybody's put so much effort into the changes that we've had over the past few years, that the fact that we've got a piss-awful distribution of services, that they actually cost too much, that they fail in many ways to meet the needs of the local communities and children, gets completely ignored in the whole process. We just go around worrying about what's happening within the services themselves in terms of the quality and things like that, which I know is important. But I think we've actually lost the plot in terms of a much more radical view, which is what I'm coming back to, which is that children's services are not there to ensure that children have education. I'm sorry. It is there to make sure that they are part of a social structure which allows children to enjoy who they are and what they are and mix with other kids and do various other things that are part of the community, and for parents to feel that they meet other parents, that they're integrated within a process. It's a much more complex thing. I think we need to do a solid rethink, and I've written it up in the Rattler past about the way things are funded and the way things are happening. Labour was not very good. This lot are going to be worse. So maybe it's time that we actually did sit down and start looking at how patriarchy, capitalism, and fuck-witted politicians, which is what they seem to breed out of those two models, have actually managed to do over the last 30 years. I'm here as a grumpy old woman, changes seem to be getting it, but I just think we need to do some serious rethinking, not only in the children's services area, but more generally. I think we need to start talking about what a good society looks like, and a good society doesn't treat children's services like the local laundromat where you drop your kid off to the one that gives you the best bargain of the week.
Yeah.
I think it's time that we actually started talking about what a good children's services seriously looks like, and it's probably not ticking the same boxes that some of the, the quality framework that puts into place. I think we need to recognise, and that's the reason I raised the Indigenous stuff there, that we need to have a great variety of ways of delivering services because they've got to reflect the needs of their local communities. I think it would be very good if the early childhood services actually incorporated some decent Indigenous contacts, relationships and cultures within every one of your services.
Yep.
I'd like to see a push to say the training, and I here do reveal that I'm actually on the board of the group, but that's not the reason I'm pushing this, because I don't think they're the only people who can do this, but that there's a real a need to incorporate the idea of Indigenous cultural training and awareness in the same way we do with child protection and first aid. It should be essential for all facilities. And I think that needs to be sort of raised as a sort of area that is actually essential. And I think we need to sort of put much more of the social agenda onto the thing there and make sure that, every service needs to be integrated to some degree in its local area, otherwise you can't do that. And you need to be able to send your kids, this was the big debate that we had with Winston McCackey, it's a good idea if you can send your kids to local services because they create relationships with other kids and other parents that you can then follow up with. At the moment you don't do that, you stick your kids in wherever you can because you get bloody desperate and you might have to drive miles away to find the services that you need. There's an awful lot wrong with the childcare sector. And I feel that somebody who's had 40 odd years of involvement in it, somewhat despairing about when I see that it does get sucked into the idea that the market will provide, and that really if we actually if we actually work really hard on the quality frameworks, it will all be fixed. I think we need to take a much wider look at what's happening, and so that we actually start talking about not only children's services but other services as part of the community, that we get back to the idea that the public sector provides the risk sharing that it should be providing. People are saying, oh yes, but that was all of that post-war welfare state. I don't think the society that we're part of now, which is the sort of post-neoliberal events of what's happening now, that sort of much more divided, much more unprogressive type society that we've got at the moment is the way to go. I think the so-called progressive political movements, quite frankly, at the moment have spent most of their time protesting rather than offering alternatives. I'm really interested in finding out whether or not there are people in the sector who are genuinely looking at how we present alternatives and working on them in a way which means maybe after the present government's managed to stuff things up further, maybe we could actually get a Labour Party that's faintly progressive about some of these social issues. Maybe there's something we could do to try and put some of these things back on the agenda. Because if we don't put them back on the agenda, this is one of the lessons that those of us who are old and sort of 70s people have got a strong feeling about is when we actually put things up in the 60s and 70s, we were optimistic about the possibilities of change. Despite the fact that a lot of things that hung over us that were politically fairly scary, like the Cold War and a few other things, we believed we could change the world, and we did. We made a lot of changes in the women's area, we made a lot of changes in sort of racial stuff, we made a lot of changes in things there. We started losing it when capitalism and power started moving back and the neoliberals took over. But neoliberalism isn't working. The GFC shows that quite clearly. But since then, unfortunately, what might be called the sort of progressive community and other sorts of movements seem to have disappeared into complaining about what they've got rather than putting up alternatives. Unless we think up the alternatives, you're not going to get people to look at change, because people will despair, they'll go home, they'll pull the doona over their head, they'll dig the backyard. There's a lot of people out there that want to see change, that are much more interested in the idea of a society that they want to live in, that they can feel comfortable in, that they can trust their neighbours and that they feel, and trust strangers. They don't like what they're seeing now, but at the moment they can't see alternatives. So this is a sector I care about because I've been, as I said, had a very long involvement in it in a whole lot of different ways. I think there's a lot more that we can do, and I suppose what I'd like to see is, fine, we've had 35 years. Can we make the next 5 years an attempt to sort of put this sector back as a serious change agent about community, and not just a deliverer of services to children within constrained hours because of the way it's funded and in the wrong places because of the way that there's no capital. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. As always, challenging us, challenging our ideas about education, challenging our ideas about community. Thank you so much. Thank you for your continuing advocacy for the early childhood sector, of course, and thank you for your advocacy around what are responsible communities. Thank you.